Alrighty, well, thank you everyone for joining us for our September webinar on disaster planning. My name is Derek Hensley. I'm a wealth advisor at Sound Stewardship, a fee-only financial planning firm in wealth management, and fee-only financial planning firm and wealth management firm in Overland Park, Kansas. I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Joel Reimer. Joel has worked at Sound Stewardship for 10 years, and before that, worked as a paramedic for 30 years. Joel has experience in planning and training around disaster preparedness, and we're excited to learn more from him. We hope to have time at the end for questions, so as they come up during our time today, feel free to use that Q&A option there on your screen. So Joel, thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you very much. And as Derek said, I work as a financial advisor at Sound Stewardship for the last 10 years. Prior to that, I worked as a paramedic for 30 years, most of those years in Manhattan, Kansas. I was thinking about like wearing my paramedic hat, my captain hat for this talk, but might be hard to talk through that. But my role as a paramedic was more as a responder in tornadoes. We've had a number of tornadoes, a lot of flooding, large fires, certainly a lot of storms that we dealt with throughout that time.
Yeah, so you're kind of trained to respond to disasters, but have you personally experienced any disasters?
Yeah, one example that I used in a blog that I wrote about disaster planning was a winter storm that we had in Manhattan in December of 2006. And so we had an ice storm come through the area. About 2 to 3 inches of ice was forming on all the power lines and branches and everything. And as you can imagine, that caused a lot of problems for the electrical grid. Power went out, and most of that area of Kansas, and I don't know if it affected Kansas City even, maybe to some extent, but we were out of power for about 2 weeks. And so here you are in the middle of winter with no power. And our home got pretty cold during that time. I think we noted that it probably got down to about 45 before we finally were able to get heat on. Now, most in my situation, I have my fuel source for the house is propane. There was some electricity as well, but propane is what ran our stove and our hot water heater. So I was able to, we were able to cook, we were able to have hot water. For those people that had an all-electric home, they didn't have that, what I'd call a luxury. The other thing that was propane was our furnace, but the furnace will not turn on unless the blower comes on to blow the heat through the house. And the blower is the electric part of the furnace. And so I didn't have any way of turning the furnace on. And so after about a week, we decided, okay, it's gotten cold enough and we're getting desperate enough, so let's go get a generator. Well, as you can imagine, by now there's no generators available anywhere in Manhattan for sure, or Junction City. And we ended up finding a generator coming in on a truck to one of the, like a Home Depot or a Lowe's or something in Topeka. And so we had to drive up there and get it right off the truck as it came, because otherwise if it went on the floor, it'd have been sold immediately. So got that home, but it's all crated up, and it's not ready to be used. So I've got to put it together, put oil in it and put fuel in it, and just all that stuff. Plus the furnace was not set up to just plug into an outlet. It was actually directly wired into the wall. So then I had to deal with changing that wiring and everything. Here I'm using a flashlight and it's cold and my hands are cold and all that.
Right.
And I finally got it all done and got the heater going. And the next order of business was to get a coffee pot going and get some hot coffee. And like within an hour of this, our power got restored and didn't need the generator anymore. So,
isn't that how that goes?
Yeah. But now we have this generator that has served us very, very well over the years for a number of different incidences. So
yeah. Oh wow. Yeah. So yeah, that's a winter storm disaster there. But what are some other disasters we might need to be thinking about in this, kind of the Midwest area, Kansas City in particular?
Yeah, and so obviously there's it's not necessarily a disaster, but just power outages from storms are probably the most common event that you may encounter. And it may be just a couple of hours of no power, or it could run into several days. We had that just real recently where parts of Kansas City was without power for a while. We also live in an area that is affected by tornadoes, maybe not as heavily as Oklahoma is, but we had
Right.
a tornado just a couple of years ago come through Dickinson County and part of Kansas City. So that affects our area as well. Flooding could be a situation that we have to encounter as well. One thing that we probably don't think about that much here is earthquakes. But this area of Kansas or of Missouri is in the New Madrid seismic zone, and there is the potential for an earthquake. In fact, the last one was a 6.7 magnitude earthquake in 1895 in this area. So we're probably due for something fairly
Yeah.
soon again. And by the way, Missouri is doing a training on this, kind of an earthquake training in October. I think it's October 19th. But so that's something to be thinking about because we
Yeah.
don't typically think about earthquakes in the Midwest.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the state's thinking about it. And so, like, as individuals, are there other considerations around earthquake, like anything with insurance, or what do we need
Well,
to?
yeah, that's a good point. Most of us don't, earthquake coverage on insurance is not a default. So that's something you'd have to add.
Okay.
And so, particularly those living in this area, it would be a good idea to have earthquake coverage because if you don't have it on there and there's an earthquake and you sustain damage, then you're not going to be covered for that. So,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's a homework item for my family this weekend there for sure.
yeah.
Um, Alrighty. So, we're talking about this disaster preparedness plan, but like, what are, things we need to incorporate into the plan?
Yeah, and so I have this divided out into four kind of bullet points: water, uh, food, shelter, and communication. And so I'll just kind of talk through these and just some ideas about this. So water, obviously we all need water. It's important for us to have that to stay hydrated. So that's one of the most important pieces that you're going to need as part of your preparation. Um, and so the idea is to have enough drinking water available for you. But you also need to be thinking about water that could be used for just, let's say, flushing toilets, for your pets to drink, for washing, just washing up and things like that. So you don't have to use bottled water necessarily for all of those.
Mm-hmm.
I did look at a resource that talked about, think about 1 gallon of water per person per day for what you would want to use. So if you're wanting to store up enough water for, let's say a week, then there's two of you in the house, then you need to think about 15 gallons,
Okay.
something like that.
Yeah.
But there's other resources as well. So you may have that bottled water, and so you have that in your shelter. But if there's time to prepare for a situation and you know that you may lose some of the utilities, I know you could fill up buckets, you could fill up your bathtub with water. Maybe you have a swimming pool and that's a resource for water that you could use, or maybe your neighbor has a pool. So just kind of think outside the box at what's available to you as a source for water as well. Um, Another one that came to mind was a waterbed. I don't know how common those are these days, but I suppose you could cut open your waterbed or do whatever you needed to get
Yeah.
water if you needed.
Yeah. Desperate times calls for desperate measures, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
One other thing to think about is if there's contamination of the water. So many times we'll have these boil warnings for, because there maybe was a water leak and there might have been contamination. And so we're just, recommending that you boil water prior to using it. There are different devices that you can get. One that comes to mind is called Life Straw, and it's just a straw that has a filter on it. It's intended for personal use, and you can use it for up to so many, gallons or something. And so it's not, to be used forever. But having a few of those in a kit
Yeah.
might be, and it may be something you take camping if you go camping. So just having something like that available might be helpful as well.
Yeah. So on the gallon per day, was that more around drinking water or was that like for your everyday needs, or?
I think what they were talking about was just general use, that a person generally would use about a gallon per day.
Okay.
But think about also, do you have pets? Do you, how many people are in your house? Do you have medical conditions that require you to have more water? That's just a general idea.
Yeah. So a mix of drinking and, if you need to wash your hands or whatever else is there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. Yeah.
And then food is the next category. And so the idea here is just to have food stored, and hopefully food that has a good shelf life. And you can get kits of food that are prepackaged that are going to last for a long time. So, you can even go to Costco, I think, and get these, or Sam's. There's a site called For Patriots on the internet that, they have food packages that you can get that'll, last for a year and that kind of thing. But that's not always necessary. I mean, just having, when you go get groceries, just get extra supplies, extra canned goods, things that are going to last, and just use that as, you're wanting to provide a supply for just a few days to a couple weeks. This is not Armageddon that we're preparing for, that we're talking about right now. This is just simply for a short-term situation. If you are using just the canned goods and supplies that you're getting as groceries, then think about rotating those through your regular food stocks so that they're not, getting extremely old.
Yeah.
And then you just replace them. The other idea is to have some way of cooking food. So if you don't have, if utilities are out and you don't have any way to cook, possibly like a camping stove, if you have access to, if it's just a power outage and you have access to your grill, well, you could grill and do that. One thing to be very cautious about is any kind of combustible fuels inside an enclosed space is going to cause carbon monoxide. And it's very common during these types of situations to have incidences where people have succumbed or had problems because of carbon monoxide, just because of doing things they shouldn't have done that were dangerous. So
you're so focused on heat or this other thing that you forget other.
You become desperate and you're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna put the grill in the house and I'm gonna heat our house with it. So then the third point is just having a shelter location. And so the idea here is to think about where in your house would serve as a shelter for most situations. Now, if it's a fire, you're going to want to get out. So you're not going to want to shelter in the house for that. And most likely for an earthquake, you would want to get out as well. But for tornadoes, just for power outages and big storms, just a safe room, either a basement room, a bathroom, or some type of a shelter that's prefabricated in your garage, or one of these outside shelters. And then that is where you're going to want to store all these supplies and have all your needs, because that's where you're going to go to. And so have everything there ahead of time. The key here is avoid the temptation to fill that with all your, Christmas trees and Christmas, just what we tend to do with spaces that aren't used. We tend to fill them up. So establish an area and then start stocking it with what you want your shelter to be stocked with.
Yeah. And another thing too is like adding items, okay, you're in the safe room, power's out. Okay, you're safe, but there's no power. It's like, okay, well, items need to be there for kids to kind of entertain them, or
what do you have there for your pets? What do you have, just different things like that. In a list that we're going to provide, it includes some things like some table games for kids and crossword puzzles and things like that, because it doesn't have to just be this hunker down and your survival. It may just be, you're just inconvenienced for a period of time and having things to do. And that brings communication is something to think about. So the idea here is, how are you going to communicate and how are you going to get information? If there's a power outage, then clearly you're not going to be able to just plug anything in, and so your radio, your cell phones only work for a limited amount of time. Your battery's going to go dead. So having a source of power to power these items, or You can get there's these weather radios are a very common item that they're a kind of a hand crank radio. It charges up the battery inside of it. That'll last for a while. They also make them so that you can plug your cell phone into them.
Oh, nice.
Many of these have like a flashlight and a siren and things like that just for notification. But having a means of communication, and then those radios provide you information about what's going on with the weather, and that's going to be important. The other thing to think about is that your phone, you may not be able to call out, but you might be able to text. So don't always just assume that just because you couldn't make a phone call that you couldn't use the phone in other ways as well. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what I think about when it comes to communication.
Yeah. And we're obviously probably wanting to check in on loved ones and whatnot, but yeah, kind of talk about what kind of what the support system should look like for someone either heading into a disaster or just experience that. Like,
yeah, I mean, this is probably part of what your life should look like prior to the disaster, is having relationships around you, whether it's your church family, your familial, your family itself and where they live. They may be affected as well, and so they may not be able to help you, but being able to communicate with each other and checking in on each other is going to be very important. But yeah, think about, just even your neighbors that are in the area, can you get a hold of them? Are they able to help, or are they trapped, or are they, under the same restrictions as we are? So I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but the idea is just think about, and that would be a natural tendency anyway, is just to check on loved ones too and make sure that everyone's doing okay.
And some other things around the communication is, satellite phones. I don't know how popular those are, but like that could be a consideration. Or are you thinking ham radio? What are your thoughts on those?
I mean, as long as they're charged up, I think satellite phones are especially useful in areas where there's no cell phone coverage, and so then you're talking directly through a satellite. Again, you'd run into the issues of, is it charged up and are you able to use it, or are you in a cellar where there's cement all around you and you can't even get out with your signal. Ham radios would be the same kind of a situation. In fact, in disasters, a lot of ham radio operators serve in roles to help with communication, just because of the availability of what they can do with their ham radio. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's helpful. So we've kind of talked about disasters and you kind of having a plan for staying at home, but what are things we need to think about if we decide to evacuate?
Yeah. It doesn't change the plan a whole lot, other than you'd want to make sure to have items that it'd be good to have items in your vehicle. We usually do this around winter time, when it starts getting cold and the snow's flying, and we start thinking about putting things in our trunk to keep us warm, to help us get out if we get stuck and things like that. So having a kit in your vehicle, kind of this evacuation kit, and there's websites that provide kind of what that should look like. But also think about some just your habits. So some of us tend to let our fuel on our vehicle get all the way to empty before we fill it up, and then we go back and we put a half a tank in or whatever. It doesn't take much more to just keep it full all the time and not let it get below half empty, so trying to remember to keep your vehicle at half a tank and no less at all times. So when it gets down to half, go fill it back up. And that's because if you have to evacuate, well, that's the wrong time to have to go get gas somewhere and sit in a line, or maybe they can't even get you fuel because the power is out. And so that would be just a habit to get into. You'd probably want to consider things like if there is the potential for disruption of utilities, maybe you want to shut off the power to your home before you leave, shut off the water supply, just so other lines break and this kind of thing happens, that your home isn't going to have more damage than what it would otherwise. Another thing that comes to mind is if you're not used to, like your garage door, for example, if the power is out, there's only one way to get that garage door open. You have to release it from the chain that lifts it and everything. And if you've never done this, when you're in a panic, kind of we got to evacuate mode is not the time to learn how that works. So practice that ahead of time and learn how that works. Maybe everybody knows about that, but
Yeah.
uh,
No,
uh,
I had a family member call me. This was probably this year or last year. It was a power outage, but like need to run an errand, and it was like, uh, how do I leave the house? I can't open and they're like, so they
yeah,
never really practiced that or whatnot. And
yeah,
so, you're trying to coach them through it, and they're like, are you sure? Like, and so, yeah,
yeah,
that is a good point. It's something that you don't necessarily think about, but
yeah,
it's good to know that how that works and just kind of have
yeah,
experience with that
exactly.
beforehand. Yeah. Yeah. And then so we have a plan in place for staying at home. We have our evacuation plan. That's having the grab and go bag with that and all that entails. But okay, how do we like practice the plan, right?
Yeah. Yeah, our kids are really good at this, right? They're in school and they're practicing all kinds of different drills,
Yeah.
fire drills, and maybe they do tornado drills. I remember when we used to do the nuclear bomb drills,
Oh,
hide under your desk and like that would protect you.
right.
Uh, but so just practicing. So the first thing would be talk through the situation. Okay, kids, we want to talk about what would we do if there is a tornado? Where are we going to go in our home? And what is the plan? And then let's go down there and let's look at where the shelter is. Let's look at what we have in there. Maybe they can help think of things they'd want to
Yeah.
add to it. But once you've talked through it, then, especially with the kids, do it in a way that you can have fun and but practicing it. And as adults, we need to practice it as well. We probably are not ones to practice things like this very often. But the idea is when emergencies arise, you are not going to rise to the occasion by doing something you've never done before. You're going to
Yeah.
fall to your lowest level of training, and you're just going to do what you've always done. So
Yeah.
you've got to practice if you intend to be able to follow through on something like this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. I'm starting to think about that for I don't know if this weekend or what, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
like that needs to
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that you have upstairs a ladder for
yeah,
evacuation, so
yeah,
it'd be good for the kids to know, well, how does this thing work? And let's
right.
practice it. And
Yeah,
because
yeah,
that could be scary going out a window on a ladder, but
right.
you
Yeah,
want to make
yeah,
sure and practice that. So
yeah, yeah. That's a good point there. Yeah. Um, so yeah, a lot of the disasters we've talked about, like assuming there's probably going to be a power outage, right?
yeah,
And so thinking about generating electricity, like what are some
yeah.
considerations around that?
Yeah. And so this comes down to basically how are you going to, what are you going to use to generate the electricity? And it's a generator of some type. And it's as simple as, a portable small thing that would be gas powered that you can plug an extension cord into and have a very limited amount of electricity, all the way up to a large generator that's wired directly into your house that comes on automatically when the power goes out. And there's a whole range in between. And there's different types of fuel sources that you consider. And so you could use gas. If you're using a gas powered generator, then you also need to think about, the little fuel tank on these will maybe last 3 to 4 hours, then you're going to be out of gas. So you need to have spare fuel on hand and available all the time. You're not going to go get it in the middle of the disaster. So or in my case, I have a propane source outside. I have a big 500-gallon tank, and so I don't have one yet, but I'd like to think about like a hybrid tank that would do gas and propane possibly, and so that'd be available. There's also solar powered generators, and the range of price starts getting higher and higher as you get into more of these devices that have the capability to actually store power for you.
Yeah,
Um, but these are good devices as well, and it just depends on how much you want to spend and what you're trying to accomplish. Um, in my case, I have a portable generator that is out in the shop. I use it for other things when I need it, but I pull it and I plug it into my house and I throw the breaker in the house so that I'm isolating just my house, and then I'm powering the outlets in the house that I want, or the breakers in the house that I want.
yeah. Um, yeah, that's one thing I didn't really think about, but the maintenance on those, right? It's usually if I'm not
Yeah,
needing it, it's out of sight, out of mind, but
yeah,
it's when you need it, then you're like, uh-oh, well, I haven't,
right.
changed the oil or the gas is old or,
Yeah,
whatever needs to be done. And so you do kind of need
yeah.
an annual,
Oh, you want to start it monthly and make sure it's going to fire right up, and just make sure it's ready to go and test it.
yeah.
Make sure it's going to work like you need. One of the things I just mentioned there was safety around electricity, and
Hmm.
so anytime that we are powering our house with a generator, you have to shut off the main breaker and isolate your house from the power grid. Otherwise, you could potentially, or I mean, you would send power out into the power lines and potentially electrocute someone that's out there trying to fix lines that they assume are dead.
Oh, yeah.
So you always shut off your main breaker. Most of the kits that you get, or if an electrician does this, it's the way it's set up, it's designed that you wouldn't even be able to turn the power on from the generator without shutting
Okay.
off the main breaker. So it's set up very, very safe, but that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So
So we have our generator up and running, plugged in or hardwired in, and the breaker shut off. We are safe. The breaker shut off. We're isolated.
yeah.
Uh, how do you know, like, when the regular power's back on? Like, if you're
Yeah,
isolated, right?
yeah, it was really funny. This it reminded me of during that ice storm. There was some people. They were didn't live right next to us, but they were, several blocks away. And this was in the wintertime, right during Christmas. And they had their Christmas lights on outside, and so here they are displaying their Christmas lights because they had power restored to them. And we still didn't have power, and we're, thinking about how can we blow dry our hair and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So but yeah, you watch what's happening around you. If you see neighbors' lights start coming back on, that'd be one way. The other thing is your electric meter that's on your house. Most of these are digital now, so if there's no power to it, it's just there. There is no little digital number there that's showing up. As soon as power is restored, there's numbers flashing showing, how much power is being used, and it cycles through some different settings. But you can, just by looking at the meter, you can tell whether power is restored, and then at that point you would go shut off the generator, turn your main breaker back on, and just switch everything back over.
Okay. Yeah. That is helpful because I'm not an electrician, and so this will all be a new field for me to
Yeah.
learn about there. So yeah, that's good. Well, let's talk about our next item there, documents, how to handle
Yeah.
those.
Yeah, so this is kind of a weird topic to bring up right in the middle of preparing for a disaster, but it is important. And the reason this kind of came to mind was in 1990, there was a tornado that came through Heston, Kansas. And it was a very large, it was an F5 tornado. And it was on the ground for, I think it was 40, 50 miles, something through that area of central Kansas. And there was documents found as far away as north east of Manhattan, you know, like receipts, canceled checks, pictures, things like that that were just
Wow.
landing, that traveled through the atmosphere and landed that far away. So the idea is, you have all these documents that you store at home. Maybe it's tax returns, maybe it's just paperwork that you have stored in a file cabinet. Well, in a tornado, that is not going to remain there. That's all going to be
Yeah.
gone. And so having any document that is important to you needs to be either in a location that's not going to get lost, or it needs to be, and or both, it needs to be scanned in
Yeah.
and digitally stored. And so we should have some documents like our birth certificates and social security cards and passports and things like this are probably in a fireproof box. If it's not at the bank in a safe deposit box, then you should have it in a fireproof box at home. And that should be in that storage, in that emergency shelter. That's probably where you should keep that. The other thing you should have in there that we don't talk about terribly often, but it's just some extra cash.
Oh, yeah.
Having some extra cash on hand if there's a power outage and you're able to get out and go get groceries or whatever, but maybe the internet's not working, and so they can't run transactions through a card or a debit machine or whatever. So having cash available is very important. So that's a good place to keep that as well, as in that little fireproof box.
Yeah. On that cash, is there like a rule of thumb? Is it $100? Is it 1,000? Is it somewhere in between or more?
I mean, I would say $100 to $200 is probably,
Okay.
I mean, you're not, again, this is short term,
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
what might you need in the very short term. Maybe you need to go
Okay.
get some gas, maybe you need to get some groceries, kind of a thing.
Well, I think that might be more than $100 now.
Well,
I don't.
yeah,
We might
maybe,
be pushing 500 there. I don't
maybe.
know. But yeah.
Yeah, you got to base that all on inflation and what it's
Right.
at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah.
But the other idea is your computer is probably not going to survive a tornado either.
Yeah.
It's going to be thrown through the air and destroyed. And so you need to be thinking about backups to what you have on your computer as well. So you've scanned in all these documents and they're on your hard drive, but how's your hard drive backed up?
Yeah.
So some people just have an external hard drive that maybe they take to work with them, and so it's off site. So that's a good plan. You have a backup off site somewhere. There's ways of digitally doing this. I use a company called carbonite.com, and it is running on my computer 24 hours a day, and it is just making copies of every single file. And anytime there's a new file or a file changes, it updates that file. So I have a backup of every single item on my computer ready access to me to get to if I would happen to lose my hard drive, or it wouldn't have to be a disaster. It could be just a failure of the computer, and I may need to restore it that way. And so there's other ways like iCloud, and there's other devices, but the idea is keep stuff stored electronically and in the cloud somewhere, so that you have access to it, because it's not going to survive if it's on paper or just on your hard drive necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good consideration. I had not heard of carbonite, but I'll have to check into that. I think a lot of stuff.
And I'm sure there's others as well.
Yeah.
I just happen to use carbonite.
So. Yeah, but just something. Hey, this is a resource out there. Have that on your radar. It doesn't have to be this one, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's helpful there. We got some time for some questions here, and so let me just look at some ones that had come through. Yeah, so if you have not, we talked about all the components of the plan, your disaster preparedness plan. If you haven't started at all, what would be like the one big takeaway to okay, start here, or make sure you at least do this if you can't do anything else?
Yeah, I guess I would say start with, where is your shelter going to be?
Yeah.
Figure out, and it may be different for different situations, but decide on what location you're going to use. And then you can start working on, okay, what am I going to put in that space? We talked about storing things that you shouldn't, like a Christmas tree and stuff, but if you go camping and you use sleeping bags, well, that's a perfect place to store your sleeping bags, because those would be very, very handy in that kind of a situation where you're trying to stay warm. But I'd say start there, and we are going to provide a list to everybody that joined us. And there's other lists available out there. There's a couple of resources that you go to. One is FEMA, FEMA, FEMA.gov. And the other one is ready.gov, READY.gov. Both of these have a lot of good information, a lot of good lists that you can use. Our list is not the most extensive list, but it's kind of like the most important things that you should think about.
Yeah. Are there any, say it's a family of four, do you talk about different roles that people might serve?
Sure. Yeah. And especially with kids, they love having responsibility and being in charge of a certain thing, and so you could practice, okay, if one of your kids is the best with the pets, for example, they're the ones that always take care of the pets. Well, it's your job, if we know, not if the house is on fire, you're not going to go running around trying to find a pet. I know some people will, because their pet is very important to them, but That's not the highest priority at that point, but if you can get to your